In science fiction, creation is everything, but some creations are born to be erased. These aren't just forgotten films, they're denied ones. Movies their own makers walked away from, erased their names from, or pretended never existed. Behind every disowned film lies a story of conflict studios taking control, edits made in secret, or visions twisted beyond recognition. Some directors hid behind the alias Alan Smithy. Some actors swore they'd never speak of the project again. And a few simply vanished, leaving their work to drift like wreckage through cinematic history. These films reveal the darker side of imagination where passion turns to regret and creation becomes betrayal, not because they were terrible, but because they became unrecognizable to those who gave them life. Tonight, we're opening the vault to 15 sci-fi films officially disowned by their creators. The lost, the shunned, the erased, because no matter how deep Hollywood buries its mistakes, some stories refuse to stay forgotten. Number 1. Zardos 1970. It's the image no one forgets. Sean Connery, in a red leather loincloth and thigh-high boots, holding a revolver in a surreal post-apocalyptic wasteland. Zardoz 1974 is one of the most bizarre science fiction films ever made and one of the most passionately disowned by those involved. Directed by John Boorman after the success of Deliverance, the film was an ambitious philosophical allegory about immortality, class division, and the decay of meaning in a post-technological future. But what audiences got was a fever dream of strange costumes, cryptic monologues, and scenes so abstract they bordered on incoherent. Sean Connery, fresh off his James Bond fame, signed on after turning down Live and Let Die. He later admitted he was desperate for work and didn't fully understand the script. Boorman, too, would later refer to the film as a mad vision that got away from me. Though it developed a cult following decades later, Zardoz was critically mocked and commercially ignored. For years, Connery refused to speak about it in interviews, and when pressed, gave dismissive responses like, "It was different." Boorman, while more generous in hindsight, often downplayed the project's intent, admitting it was likely too weird, too soon. Even its most iconic image, Connery's costume, has become a meme in modern pop culture, often stripped of its original, if convoluted, meaning. Zardoz wasn't just misunderstood, it was abandoned by the men who made it, quietly pushed aside like a family secret. And yet, it endures an artifact too strange to embrace, too unforgettable to ignore. Sometimes, the final shame isn't being forgotten, it's being remembered for all the wrong reasons. Number 2. Saturn 31980. Saturn III was meant to be intelligent sci-fi horror. What it became was a film everyone involved tried to escape from. Set on a remote space station orbiting Saturn, the story follows two scientists whose isolated peace is shattered when a third visitor arrives, along with a violent experimental robot named Hector. On paper, it's a promising premise, but production was chaotic from the very start. The original director, John Barry, Oscar-winning production designer of Star Wars, was fired just weeks into filming. Star actor Kirk Douglas reportedly clashed with him and exercised his influence to have Barry replaced. Veteran director Stanley Donen took over, but the damage was done. The set was tense. Script rewrites were constant. Farrah Fawcett, cast opposite Douglas, later hinted she was misled about the tone of the film. And Kirk Douglas himself, who fought to control the creative process, was said to be deeply disappointed with the final result. What emerged was a disjointed blend of psychological dread, awkward erotica, and underdeveloped robot terror. Reviews were scathing, the film bombed at the box office, and the people behind it vanished. Kirk Douglas never publicly acknowledged the film again. Farrah Fawcett skipped interviews about it. Donen distanced himself from it for the rest of his career. Even the robot, meant to be terrifying, became the subject of ridicule. Few films feel as orphaned as Saturn III. It wasn't sabotaged by censorship or moral panic, it was undone from within, by egos, mistrust, and a loss of creative clarity. And when no one claims the child, you know something went very wrong in the womb. Number 3. A Sound of Thunder, 2005. What if a sci-fi film altered its own timeline so badly that even its creators wanted to erase it? A Sound of Thunder, based loosely on Ray Bradbury's famous short story, was meant to explore the butterfly effect of time travel. One small action in the past causes catastrophic changes in the future. The concept remains legendary, but the film adaptation? a spectacular failure that left no one willing to claim it. Plagued by a collapsed production company, budget overruns, and rushed CGI work, the film's release was delayed multiple times. When it finally hit theaters, it looked unfinished. Special effects were described as PlayStation 1 level, backgrounds flickered, digital creatures floated awkwardly, and yet, it was released anyway. Director Peter Hyams, known for solid sci-fi efforts like 2010, The Year We Make Contact, was reportedly locked out of post-production after initial delays. He gave few interviews, offered no defense of the film, and never mentioned it again in later retrospectives. Even Edward Burns, the film's star, distanced himself from it during press tours. Internally, several people involved in production allegedly refused to participate in DVD commentary tracks. What was supposed to be a thoughtful, time-bending thriller became a cautionary tale of what happens when vision meets budgetary ruin. A Sound of Thunder didn't just misrepresent Bradbury's brilliance, it left a crater so wide, no one dared stand near it afterward. Number 4. Slipstream, 1989. When a producer of Star Wars makes a sci-fi movie no one remembers and doesn't want to remember, you know something went wrong. Slipstream, 1989, had the pedigree, co-written and produced by Gary Kurtz, best known for producing Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. It starred Mark Hamill and Bill Paxton. Its concept, an Earth ravaged by climate collapse, with humanity living along powerful wind currents, was ambitious and timely. But none of that mattered when the final product failed to fly. The production ran into issues from day one. Kurtz's vision was abstract and philosophical, blending myth, nature, and post-apocalyptic politics. But distributors panicked. They wanted something more accessible, more action, less existentialism. Kurtz compromised, and compromised again, until the film's core ideas were reduced to fragments. The film stumbled through multiple cuts, never receiving a proper US theatrical release. Even with its high-profile cast, Slipstream was dumped unceremoniously into limited international markets and quickly forgotten. Mark Hamill rarely mentions the role in interviews, and Gary Kurtz avoided talking about the film for the rest of his career. Those who worked on it later described the final product as a butchered version of something once interesting. For a movie about winds carrying the remnants of civilization, Slipstream vanished, without a trace, carried away by the very forces it tried to warn us about. Number 5. The Time Guardian, 1987. Sometimes, a director gets to make their movie and still wants nothing to do with it afterward. The Time Guardian, a 1987 Australian sci-fi production, had an intriguing premise. Time-traveling soldiers protect Earth's last city from invading cyborgs. The potential for a thoughtful dystopian narrative was there, but what reached theaters was something else entirely. Director Brian Hannant, who had worked as a second-unit director on Mad Max 2, originally co-wrote the screenplay and intended the film to be a character-driven, futuristic war allegory. But once production began, things fell apart. Budget cuts forced massive rewrites. Producers demanded more action, less dialogue. Subplots were scrapped. Whole character arcs vanished. The final version barely resembled Hannant's original vision. Dialogue became stilted. The story's emotional core was lost. And what remained was a low-budget, visually inconsistent film that confused audiences and critics alike. Hannant was so disappointed with the outcome that he refused to promote the film and stepped away from directing entirely afterward. Interviews with the cast suggest that morale collapsed midway through shooting, with several crew members describing the production as rudderless. Despite its flashy poster and promising setup, The Time Guardian is mostly forgotten today, except in lists like this, where its director's silent departure speaks louder than the film itself. It wasn't banned, it wasn't censored, it was just left behind by its creator, like a future that never arrived. Number 6. Battlefield Earth, 2000. It was supposed to be John Travolta's passion project. It became Hollywood's favorite punchline. Battlefield Earth, 2000, based on the novel by L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, was plagued from the start. Despite Travolta's enthusiasm and star power, the film's bizarre direction, clunky dialogue, tilted camera angles, and cartoonish acting turned it into an unintentional comedy. But what many don't know is how many of the original crew and writers actively distanced themselves after release. While Travolta continued to promote the film, insisting it was misunderstood, others involved fled the scene. Some screenwriters claimed their drafts had been rewritten beyond recognition. One even requested their name be removed from international versions. Directorial control was also murky. Reports surfaced that Travolta, a key financier and Scientologist, heavily influenced decisions leading to tension on set. The result was a film that felt oddly out of time, stylized like a 1,980 seconds cartoon, despite being released in 2000. Critics were brutal, audiences laughed in the wrong places, and the film swept the Golden Raspberry Awards, winning Worst Picture of the Decade. To this day, Battlefield Earth is taught in screenwriting courses as an example of how not to adapt source material. Behind closed doors, several involved parties referred to it as career-damaging, and when later asked about it, many gave the same answer: "I'd rather not talk about that movie." It wasn't just disowned, it was buried under layers of denial. Number 7. Alien 3. 1992. Alien 3 is the rare blockbuster where nearly everyone involved walked away in disappointment, even the director who would later become a legend. David Fincher's directorial debut was supposed to be a career-launching moment. Instead, it became an ordeal so soul-crushing that Fincher later refused to claim ownership of the final product. The film, riddled with studio interference, on-set rewrites, and last-minute production changes, bears only fragments of Fincher's original vision. The story about Ripley crash landing on a prison planet overrun by both inmates and an alien was dark, bleak, and thematically rich in concept. But the execution was chaotic. Studio executives rejected Fincher's creative direction, rewrote scenes without his input, and forced an accelerated shooting schedule. Fincher has been open about his resentment. "Nobody hated it more than I did," he once said. He distanced himself from the film in interviews for years, refusing to participate in retrospectives and directors' commentaries. In later editions, Fox offered a re-edit closer to his original vision, but Fincher declined to be involved. The cast and crew were also left frustrated. Sigourney Weaver called the experience difficult and demoralizing. Screenwriters came and went. Entire subplots were cut. The resulting film feels jagged, stitched together from ideas that were never meant to coexist. And yet, Alien 3 has its defenders. Some hail it as a bold, uncompromising entry that dared to break convention, but its director wants no credit. For Fincher, it's not a misunderstood masterpiece. It's a project he disowned the moment it wrapped. Number 8. Cyborg 21993. There are some films so forgettable, even their stars work overtime to erase them from memory. Cyborg 21993 was a straight-to-video sequel that had little to do with the original Cyborg 1989, and even less to do with quality filmmaking. What it's most remembered for, if at all, is marking the film debut of Angelina Jolie, and it's one she's tried hard to forget. Set in a dystopian future where corporations design humanoid weapons, Cyborg 2 attempts a mix of martial arts, cyberpunk intrigue, and Cold War paranoia. The result is a tonally confused mess, stitched together with bad dialogue, awkward performances, and budget-level effects. Jolie, only 17 at the time, plays a prototype cyborg programmed to explode during a corporate infiltration. Years later, she described the experience as a painful memory and urged fans not to seek out the film. In one interview, she said bluntly, "I wouldn't want to watch it. I wouldn't want you to watch it." Behind the scenes, things weren't much better. The director clashed with producers over tone and pacing, and the final cut deviated significantly from what the cast believed they were making. Some crew members quietly distanced themselves after release. Despite its rarity and minor cult status among VHS collectors, Cyborg 2 is a film disavowed from the inside out. Its own star would rather pretend it never happened, and for many, it didn't. Number 9. The Lawnmower Man, 1992. This is the rare case where the author didn't just disown the adaptation, he sued it out of existence. The Lawnmower Man was marketed heavily as Stephen King's The Lawnmower Man, complete with trailers, posters, and opening credits bearing his name. The only problem? The movie had almost nothing to do with King's original short story. King's story is a surreal, blood-soaked parable about a man who discovers his lawn service is run by a pagan god-worshipping maniac. The movie, on the other hand, is a tech thriller about a mentally disabled gardener turned into a digital super being through VR experiments. The only thing they share is a title, Furious, King filed a lawsuit demanding his name be removed. He won twice. The courts ordered that all future releases strip his credit, and even threatened monetary penalties for every copy that still bore the false association. This wasn't just a legal move, it was a public disavowal. The studio tried to backpedal, claiming the spirit of King's work remained, but the damage was done. King was adamant, "This is not my story, I had nothing to do with it." Even decades later, fans remain confused by the connection. Ironically, The Lawnmower Man did moderately well at the box office, and developed a cult following largely thanks to its early exploration of virtual reality. But in Stephen King's canon, it remains a ghost entry, a title he wrote, attached to a film he refused to claim. It's not just a bad adaptation, it's a case study in creative hijacking. Number 10. Screamers, The Hunting, 2009. There are sequels you never asked for, and then there are sequels that even the original creators refuse to acknowledge. Screamers, The Hunting, 2009, was marketed as a follow-up to the cult sci-fi horror. Screamers, 1995, itself adapted from a Philip K. Dick short story. But by the time this direct-to-video sequel arrived, it bore almost no resemblance to its predecessor, either thematically or creatively. The screenwriters of the original had no involvement. The studio made no real effort to retain continuity. And worst of all, the resulting film was so low budget and uninspired that several people associated with the original project requested to be left off the credits entirely. The film is a flat, generic monster movie set on a desolate planet, featuring a group of humans being hunted by the titular machines. But gone are the psychological tensions, political themes, and moral ambiguity that gave the first Screamers its bite. What remains is a hollow shell, stamped with a recognizable title for marketing purposes. When asked about the sequel, screenwriter Dan O'Bannon's estate issued a sharp statement. This film was not based on his work, nor was it authorized by him. The implication was clear. Screamers, The Hunting was not just bad, it was unwelcome, even by the legacy it tried to exploit. In the end, it didn't just fail as a film, it failed as an heir to anything. Number 11. Dune Extended TV Cut, 1984. Not all disownments happen at the time of release. Some come years later when a beloved film is resurrected in a form its creator never agreed to. David Lynch's Dune, 1984, was already a controversial adaptation of Frank Herbert's dense novel, but what aired on television years later was something else entirely. In the late 1980 seconds, a longer extended cut was prepared for TV syndication. It added nearly an hour of deleted footage, rearranged the structure, and inserted a monotone narrator explaining key plot points with crude storyboards. Lynch was not involved. Worse, he actively opposed this version. In response, he invoked his right to remove his name from the credits. The director credit for the TV cut reads Alan Smithee, and the screenplay is credited to Judas Booth, a biting pseudonym Lynch created himself, combining Judas Iscariot and John Wilkes Booth, both infamous betrayers. This wasn't just about edits. It was about betrayal of vision. Lynch, known for his atmospheric storytelling and elliptical structure, saw his Dune sliced into something blunt and linear, stripped of mystery, tone, and nuance. The TV cut now floats in fan communities as a curiosity, but Lynch has publicly said he does not recognize it as his film and even discourages fans from watching it. It's not a director's cut. It's a hijacking disguised as a restoration. And so, Dune joins the rare category of films with two identities, one public and one disavowed by the artist who gave it life. Number 12. Highlander 2. The Quickening, 1991. There can be only one except when there's a sequel no one wants to claim. Highlander 2. The Quickening is one of the most reviled sequels in sci-fi history, not because it simply failed, but because it violated everything the original stood for. The first Highlander was a cult success, a gritty, poetic fantasy about immortals fighting through the ages. The sequel? It turned them into aliens from another planet and introduced a plot so incoherent, even the cast didn't understand it. Director Russell Mulcahy tried to walk away from the project mid-edit. Christopher Lambert allegedly threatened to quit multiple times. Sean Connery, returning for a baffling cameo, later refused to discuss the film publicly. The production was plagued by budget issues, location problems in Argentina, and last-minute rewrites forced by insurance companies. What emerged was a bizarre, contradictory mess that made both fans and creators cringe. Mulcahy reportedly stormed out of the premiere, furious that his vision had been butchered. He would later return years later to create a renegade cut, attempting to restore some logic and dignity, but the damage was done. The official theatrical version of Highlander 2 remains a film disowned by its own DNA. It's rare to see an entire franchise reject its own sequel. Rarer still for the creators themselves to pretend it never happened. But with the quickening, everyone involved seemed eager to forget. Number 13. The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1996. What happens when a movie mutates beyond its creator's control? You get The Island of Dr. Moreau, or at least something wearing its skin. This 1996 adaptation of H.G. Wells's classic novel is infamous not just for its bizarre plot, but for the disaster that unfolded behind the scenes. Director Richard Stanley had spent years developing the project, envisioning a haunting, philosophical story about human identity, cruelty, and science gone rogue. But just a few days into filming, Stanley was fired. Studio executives didn't trust his vision. His replacement? Veteran director John Frankenheimer, who took the film in an entirely different direction. What followed was chaos, constant rewrites, feuding actors, and escalating weirdness. Marlon Brando showed up in white face paint and demanded a miniature double of himself. Val Kilmer refused to follow the script. Stanley, heartbroken, snuck back onto set disguised as an extra, just to witness what became of his dream. The finished film is an awkward Frankenstein of competing ideas, part psychological horror, part surrealist satire, part unintentional comedy. It has a cult following today, but Stanley has always refused to recognize it as his own. In interviews, he calls it a film I never got to make and distances himself from every frame that made it to screen. The Island of Dr. Moreau wasn't just a failed movie, it was a dream dissected and reassembled by hands that didn't believe in it. And like the creatures in the film, it became something grotesquely unrecognizable. Number 14. Solar Crisis, 1990. The sun is dying, Earth is doomed, and no one wants to admit they made this film. Solar Crisis was meant to be an international sci-fi epic, a big-budget collaboration between Japanese and American studios that aimed to rival 2001, A Space Odyssey. What it became instead was a cinematic cautionary tale. The film's credited director, Alan Smithee, wasn't a real person. It was the go-to pseudonym used in Hollywood whenever a filmmaker refused to have their name associated with the final product. The actual director, Richard C. Sarafian, watched helplessly as the film was re-edited without his approval. Subplots were removed, tones shifted, crucial scenes vanished, and what remained was an incoherent mess with stiff performances and cheap-looking effects that couldn't match its ambitious premise. Its story about a spaceship mission to drop a bomb into the sun to prevent a solar flare from destroying Earth should have been tense and urgent. But instead, Solar Crisis limped across the screen with lifeless pacing and baffling dialogue. No wonder Sarafian washed his hands of it. Even more damning, the film's release was so quiet, even sci-fi fans barely noticed it happen. Today, it lives in obscurity, referenced more in discussions about the Alan Smithee phenomenon than for its own merits. The true tragedy of Solar Crisis isn't that it was bad, it's that someone believed in it enough to direct it and then had to pretend they didn't. Number 15. Supernova, 2000. Before the final cut even reached theaters, one man had already disowned it. Supernova, 2000, is a textbook case of a film that collapsed under its own post-production nightmare. Originally helmed by acclaimed director Walter Hill, this sci-fi thriller was meant to be a dark, cerebral story about deep space isolation and body horror. But by the time it was released, the version that audiences saw was unrecognizable, a patchwork of reshoots, studio meddling, and re-edits. Hill was so furious with the end result that he invoked a rare Hollywood option. He pulled his name from the project, replacing it with the generic pseudonym Thomas Lee. Even Francis Ford Coppola was brought in later to salvage the film, though by then, it was already too far gone. Critics panned it, audiences ignored it, and its director pretended it didn't exist. The film itself is disorienting. An emergency medical rescue turns into a grotesque mutation tale on a mining ship, spliced with out-of-place erotic scenes and erratic pacing. The original vision, bleak, atmospheric, intimate, was buried beneath layers of sci-fi cliches and last-minute edits. It wasn't just altered, it was hijacked. Hill later referred to the studio's version as a betrayal of everything we were building. He refused to attend press events and never mentioned the film again in interviews. And unlike many directors who quietly accept changes, Hill made sure his fingerprints were erased. So if you've seen Supernova, chances are you didn't really see Supernova. Bonus fact: nothing lasts forever. 1984. And before we reach the end, let's talk about a film that never got the chance to be disowned because it was never properly born. Nothing Lasts Forever, 1984, is one of the strangest entries in sci-fi history. Written and directed by Tom Schiller, an SNL veteran and protege of Lorne Michaels, the film starred Zach Galligan, Gremlins, Bill Murray, and Dan Aykroyd in a dystopian tale of art, control, and lunar utopias. Shot in black and white with deliberate homage to 1932 cinema, it tells the story of a young man conscripted by a totalitarian port authority only to discover a hidden society on the moon that speaks in riddles and dreams. Sounds surreal? It is. And yet, that's not what buried the film. MGM, the studio behind it, pulled the movie from release just weeks before its premiere. No official explanation was given. The cast and crew were left in limbo. Bill Murray, one of the film's supporters, refused to comment publicly. Schiller, devastated, later called the experience a total vanishing. The film was never released on home video, never screened theatrically in the US, and circulated only through underground VHS trades and leaked TV airings in Europe. For decades, it remained a phantom technically completed, yet totally orphaned. No one outright disowned Nothing Lasts Forever. But no one fought for it, either. It exists in a liminal state too weird for executives, too poetic for mainstream sci-fi, and too unknown for most of its creators to claim. Some films are forgotten, some are erased. But this one? It simply never officially happened. Even in a genre defined by imagination, some creations are so broken, so betrayed, that even their makers turn away. These films weren't just abandoned, they were erased from legacy, struck from memory, buried by their own bloodlines. But maybe that makes them more fascinating. Which of these sci-fi outcasts do you think deserves a second look? And which one should remain forgotten exactly as their creators intended? Let us know in the comments below. Because sometimes the films people try hardest to forget are the ones we remember most.